begin, since we're in a political season in the United States, and the summit will be taking place in Chicago, and in addressing groups like this, I am reminded of another incident that occurred in Chicago in 1968, and it's when Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president at the time, was running for the Democratic nomination for president. And the vice president had this habit of speaking at great length on topics. And apparently, as the story goes, his wife, Muriel, warned him as he was getting up to the podium to address the Democratic delegates and said, "Hubert, just remember, in order to be immortal, your speech need not be eternal." And he didn't listen to his wife, and he droned on and on. He lost the attention of the delegates there, who were concerned about demonstrators outside. He lost the attention of the national audience, and eventually he lost the election. So one commitment I have this afternoon is that I will not repeat Hubert Humphrey's mistake. I have not come prepared with a formal lecture. It's really not my style. But I would like to say, to kick off what I hope will be a conversation with you, a few points on the kind of the strategic context is seen from one person in Washington, and frankly, I'm only representing my own views here. National Defense University is a defense organization. So I still work for the Department of Defense. But we have in our institute a certain freedom to, when we write, as long as we do it with a disclaimer that we're not representing official government views, to do that. And I should mention that we do internal work for the Pentagon, but we also do an interesting service, I think, in linking up people from within the military and the defense establishment and others in government with people in non-government organizations, research institutes, maybe such as this one, people from the press and academic backgrounds, because the government doesn't have all of the answers. But then we have this public outreach. So with that bit of a disclaimer, but I want to say a few words about the strategic concept. I think or strategic context. It's important, I think, to understand where the United States is coming from when you're looking at how we approach a very changing and very unpredictable strategic environment. I'd like to relate this then to some of the issues that have been troubling or challenging NATO in various ways and what we might expect from the Chicago Summit. And then we can just open it up. And if there are other topics, and I won't be able to cover them all in depth. On the first, the very interesting document that was released with a fair amount of fanfare in early January, which is new strategic guidance for the Department of Defense, with a short forward by the President. And then after that, it's essentially the Secretary of Defense's vision, informed obviously by the civilians and the military in the department on global strategy seen from the defense angle. What caught the headlines in this document was a so-called quote-unquote pivot to Asia and the Pacific. And pivot, to be fair, was the term used by the Secretary of State when she was writing an article late last year on the subject. It's actually not the term used in the Defense Department. They speak of a rebalancing. The essence of this comes down to just a couple of points, which, once you hear them, may appear self-evident, but it is necessary to point them out. One is that for the United States, we've been at war for a decade. Actually, it's been a little bit over a decade. I happened, because I was working in the Pentagon at the time, I was there on 9/11. I saw what that type of shock to the American system did to frankly, to the psyche of my own children, not to mention the broader psyche of the country. And we began at that time a tremendous expansion in military budgets, in forces, and obviously in commitments. In Afghanistan, and then in a more controversial way, obviously, in Iraq in 2003. But that era of extended and very expensive, very demanding counterinsurgency operations is hopefully drawing to a close. The forces, American forces, you realize, are already gone from Iraq. Beginning at, well, it didn't actually begin there, but going back to the previous summit, November 2010 in Lisbon, NATO agreed that there would be a reduction in forces as we transfer more and more authority to the Afghan National Security Forces, which is normal, more responsibility for defending their own country. But the threats haven't gone away in the world. And these are threats that sometimes they don't appear perhaps to directly affect Ireland, but they actually do affect, and potentially could affect in even more serious ways, the international environment that you live in. There have been some successes. Osama bin Laden is not the only high-ranking or important figure in the al-Qaeda network that's been removed from the battlefield in recent years. There have been some successes in fighting this problem of international terrorism, but it does still exist in the world, and it's going to continue. The military tool is only one of the tools one can use here, but one shouldn't have a false sense of security that because Osama bin Laden is dead, then all is fine and we can go back to somehow a pre-2001 mentality. At the same time, there are other areas where both state actors and non-state actors are developing capabilities that are of concern to all of us, both on the security and also more broadly on the societal, economic, and financial front. I'm thinking of the potential in using cyber tools or cyber weapons, if you will. People speak of cyber attacks for a variety of reasons, for intelligence gathering, for criminal enterprises, but potentially the use of these against military systems that we depend upon. And these are things that are both in the hands of state and non-state actors. Continuing concern with proliferation. The two leading examples in any American list would be North Korea and Iran. So the challenges are still out there, even as we try to bring to an end this era of large-scale military operations in counterinsurgency. And I forgot to mention, there are continual surprises. If you had asked the 28 heads of state and government in November of 2010 at Lisbon, would they expect to be mounting an important military operation in Libya 4 months later, they probably would have said, no, you're crazy, we're not going there. My short reason why NATO was very useful or important to keep around is you can sum it up in 2 words, and that is stuff happens. And you need an alliance sometimes in order to react. And all of this is set against the background that I know you feel very keenly in Ireland, but we feel very keenly in the United States, and that's a question of debt, deficit, and the need to do something about it. It's striking over the past year or so that our chairman, and we've had a change over the past year, the outgoing and now the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff speak of the deficit problem as a national security concern. And in fact, before he left office, Admiral Mullen, when asked for what are your top national security concerns, I believe he mentioned the deficit. So we are reducing what has been a very large, and what frankly is still a very large defense budget. Because of the law and I would say, a not so pretty compromise reached with Congress, our budget, planned budget for the 2013 fiscal year is going down in real terms from the previous year. And over the next 10 years, there are already program cuts of approximately $480 billion. This is a reduction over planned budgets. If Congress is unsuccessful in changing the law on this budget compromise by the end of this year, we're headed for a train wreck. We're headed for, the term we use is sequester. This is an automatic cut, in another 500, potentially a little bit more, 500 billion over the next 10 years. So the United States could be confronting by the end of this year, unless we find the political wisdom to change this law in an equitable fashion, a $1 trillion reduction over 10 years, in which case the strategy I'm about to describe may be somewhat irrelevant. So this is a big, challenging time. Of course, defense budgets are coming down in Europe. I'll come back to that as well. But the United States is not exempt from these pressures, and we have to do something about it. Last word on defense budgets is, at the same time, we shouldn't over-exaggerate the budget. The budget, as I said, almost doubled since 2001, and it's still quite high. We'll be spending this coming year on the order of $525 billion in 1 year, and that doesn't include the costs of Afghanistan. If you add in Afghanistan, it's about another $85 billion. Even if all of these cuts that I mentioned come into place, we'll still be spending as much as the next 10 countries in the world combined. Probably will represent 40% of world defense spending, and many of those other countries, of course, are US allies. But the budget pressures are real, and this changing security environment mean that we have to change the strategy somewhat. Quickly on the shift to Asia, and I'm not an Asian expert, but I can tell you frankly, there's a lot of continuity in efforts that began under the Clinton administration and accelerated somewhat under the Bush administration in various ways. Those administrations were already beginning to look at a realignment of US forces in Europe, in Asia, I'm sorry. They were beginning to look at also increasing trade relations with Asia. Now, most of our merchandise trade, or the largest merchandise trade partner, is Asia. It's not Europe anymore. What's a little bit new and important in the Obama administration, I would say, are some of the more flexible and pointed security arrangements that we're building now in Asia. For a couple of reasons. China is not the only reason, but it is a major reason. No one that I know of in the United States is looking for a war or a military confrontation with China. But you can't deny that they are increasing their military capabilities. And here and there, and particularly in the South China Sea, there have been a number of incidents, even including with the socialist neighbor Vietnam, but also with the Philippines, with Japanese, shipping with others there. Growing concern about how does China intend to use its military power in the region, and is it intending to use it in a way that excludes the ability of the United States to defend allies in the region and to maintain free navigation in international waters, some of which now the Chinese claim for themselves, for example, in the South China Sea. How is this evidencing itself? It is in what is going to be greater naval and Air Force cooperation with Japan. It involves here and there stationing of some forces in places where we didn't do it before. For example, up to 2,500 Marines in Australia, and perhaps some Navy capacities eventually in Australia. It's a renewal of military ties with the Philippines that had withered quite a bit in recent years. Even the home porting of 4 US ships for the first time in Singapore. They're not there yet, but they're coming. There are a couple of risks in doing all of this. There's a risk, I think, in not responding to the Chinese assertiveness in the area, because there is a narrative in parts of Beijing that the United States is in inexorable decline, and they can push and develop capacities to deny access, US access in the area where we could defend allies and defend shipping lanes and so forth. And if you don't respond, you can encourage that. But immediately there's the flip concern as well, and that is that if you can respond only in a military fashion, you could actually exacerbate the problem, make the argument for hardliners in China that China has to do more, that the US is out there to encircle them, to somehow prompt a confrontation, and so forth. President Obama, when he was in Asia, mentioned that the Asia Pacific will not suffer from any of these cuts in the defense budget, which raises the question of, which I'll come back to, where else in the world is going to bear the burden of some of these reductions. It also reflects itself in the nature of our forces. Our ground forces over the next 5 years, I think it is, are going to be cut by about 100,000. That's a hefty cut. It's not quite 20%, but it's approaching that. It's interesting to note that our naval forces are not being reduced, and not by very much. A lot of people expected the administration to cut the number of aircraft carriers from 11 to 10, maybe even 9. It's staying at 11. It's interesting, isn't it, that naval power is perhaps most relevant when you look at Asia and the Pacific. And finally, I mean, broadly speaking, there's always a risk that an administration will say, this is our new policy, this is what we're going to do, and either doesn't follow through, or a successor generation or a successor administration comes in and says, we have a different idea, in which case the United States loses its credibility vis-a-vis others, for example, the Chinese, who have a very long memory and I think a very strategic view of the world. What does all of this mean for Europe? In specific terms, part of this rebalancing means, and I think this is a normal thing, to look at what is our position in Europe, what's the rationale for US forces, at what level, and it's beyond just the number of forces. What are they doing? How are they positioned? What are their activities? A lot of attention has been paid to the fact that we had, on paper, 4 brigade combat teams stationed in Europe. And I say on paper because, in fact, 2 of those 4 for the past decade have mainly been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. So de facto, we've had 2 brigade combat teams in Europe for the past decade. And in a way, we're simply being honest with the books right now. And in the future, we're going to have permanent positioning of 2. However, the fact that we're reducing some of those overseas deployments actually means that we have more US forces that can also rotate to Europe and train with allies. And I would say allies and partners. It's extremely important. It's not just about Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which is collective defense. It's also about maintaining the type of cooperation that allows us, when there's a political agreement, to do it. And in the end, these are all sovereign decisions. It allows us to train together so that we can deploy and operate either on the periphery of Europe, as we have in the Balkans, or farther afield, Afghanistan, Libya, whatever. It's extremely important to have that presence there. There's no magic number, in my view, but there is, at some level, there's some threshold at which you begin to lose those connections. And it's not just physical interoperability, it's intellectual operability. It's understanding how you approach, and not just military issues, but civil military issues over time. And that you also develop the trust that your ally or your partner will be there, and they develop that trust in us as well. And actually, in some areas, we're increasing our presence. I'd mentioned in missile defense. We reached an agreement with Spain to home port 4 missile defense destroyers in Rota, Spain. If we didn't have that agreement, it would require the United States to deploy not to deploy, but to assign up to 20 destroyers in order to cover the rotation time, in order to have the same forces present in the Mediterranean. For missile defense, against whom? It is not against Russia. Something you may have heard a lot of, because a week or so ago the Russians had a big conference on missile defense and said, no, missile defense is somehow aimed at Russia, it's aimed at surrounding Russia, posing a threat somehow to Russian strategic forces. Rhetoric of the Cold War. And this is a segue, I think, into the Chicago Summit. Let me speak briefly of a couple of the priorities. And then I want to mention, I'll end with 3 or 4 minutes or less, on the subject that isn't on the agenda, but is still a very important one, and I think particularly for an Irish audience. What's on the agenda for Americans, I think there's no question, as you mentioned, top of the agenda is Afghanistan. No mystery here. We still have 85,000 troops in Afghanistan. Europeans have over 30,000. Many, but not all of those are actual NATO allies. And their contributions from non-European actors, I would note here significantly the Australians, who have done a very, very good job over a very extended period of time in Afghanistan. And yet they're not members of the alliance, they're not members even of Partnership for Peace. Military leaders that we see at National Defense University and in other venues, I have to tell you, they are not saying something different in private than they are in public. In private, they're making the same arguments, and I think it's because they're accurate and they believe them. And that is, on the strictly security front, despite these occasional high-profile attacks, often suicide attacks, often really just killing other Afghans, in the overall security picture, it's improved over the past 2 years because of a different strategy, a more kind of comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy, and also some additional forces for a period of time, the Afghan surge. It's true, it's a mixed picture, depending on where you're looking at throughout the country. But by and large, the Afghan National Security Forces are taking the lead with our support in more and more operations. Afghan security forces are now roughly responsible for territory that includes roughly 50% of the population. Some of the units apparently are quite good. It's not without problems, but it's not as bleak of a picture as some people would make out. There is a challenge there with the size of those forces. The target was to reach about 350,000, that's combined police and soldiers, by the end of this September. And they'll probably reach the target, but we've learned that looking ahead, that target is probably unsustainable. And so I think there's going to be a serious discussion in Chicago about actually reducing the sizes of those forces, maybe down, I've heard the figure of 230,000 or so. I don't know that will be the final agreement, but it's a possibility after 2014. That will still cost a lot of money. We, the US, are spending, I think, roughly $11 billion a year now on training Afghan security forces. The projection is even with a smaller force, after 2014, it might require $4 to $5 billion. The American taxpayer, in my humble view, doesn't want to pay that whole bill. So we're going to be looking for, the US will be looking for other contributors within NATO and some from outside NATO. Could include Japan, for example, even some of the Gulf states. That will be one of the issues. Another issue will be the schedule of withdrawal. There have been some individual NATO allies that have, let's say, announced their own national schedules, not always in great coordination with the rest of the alliance. Okay. I understand an alliance is based on consensus. People have different national prerogatives, but the principle of in together, out together, as much as possible, it's very important to the political solidarity of an alliance, and it has to be maintained. The Lisbon Summit document was very general about that, saying we would transition by the end of 2014 to an Afghan lead throughout the country. It's time now to get a little bit more detailed about how that transition between 2012, between now and 2014 is going to work. And then what about after 2014? It's not an on and off switch where you turn off the lights and the ISAF allies leave. The US, for its part, I don't know exactly what the figures will be, but I'm convinced we'll be there for some years to come with forces that are specialized in training. We're already changing the way we organize brigades sent to Afghanistan so that they're more oriented towards teams that actually work within the Afghan forces. and probably some forces there capable of carrying out what we call the counter-terrorist operations. But winding down the more large-scale combat lead that we've done in recent years. But I don't think Americans want to be alone there, or just with a quote-unquote coalition of the willing of a small number of countries. It's much better. It's much better for the alliance. In my humble opinion, it's much better for the United States as well, if we're not there alone. It's not only a question of legitimacy, it's a question of what we're projecting, international legitimacy, it's a question of what we're projecting towards the Afghans themselves. And if you want to think about the risks of leaving Afghanistan prematurely, just think about its neighbor, Pakistan, where they have a very active insurgency of their own in an important part of their territory. This is a country with dozens, perhaps more, of nuclear weapons. It's not in anyone's interest in Ireland, in the rest of Europe, or in the United States to see a nation like that implode because next door extremists have said, look, we've won, we've chased the infidels out, we're going to do the same here in Pakistan as well. It won't be the only subject, and in the interest of time, I'm going to be very quick on the two others. One is, and it's maybe not the most felicitous of terms, a term of smart defense. I mentioned to you, or reminded you, because I'm sure you're already aware of it, that defense is also suffering from an austerity cure, if you will, in Europe. And this is likely not going to change in future years, not in the near term. NATO over the years, and individual allies within NATO, has looked at ways to try to improve multinational cooperation in a variety of ways, and we've branded it in different ways. When I was in the Pentagon doing this, we called it the Defense Capabilities Initiative. After the Prague Summit, there was another term. After the Lisbon Summit, another term. We have learned something from all of these efforts, and hopefully there will be a package of ideas. These may not strike you as showstoppers, as great dramatic steps, but I think we'll see some practical steps in multilateral cooperation, even in important but costly things like training, logistics, and so forth, where we're going to see, I hope, better efforts by multilateral groups to do things together. There are two big problems here, and these are not conceptual problems, these are real problems. One I would just label sovereignty. There are several larger nations, but believe me, there's several smaller nations as well that look at their forces, look at their capabilities and say, I have questions. I have questions about putting an effort into a collective capability, collective asset, that could be subject to the consensus rule that all 28 allies can agree. And what if an ally or two don't agree? Then I can't use those assets. And I still may want to conduct that mission then in a coalition of the willing, or even nationally, or under a different UN mandate, and I can't do it. And sovereignty also implies trust, that you, if you have a sharing of roles, or a specialization of roles, that you know that if there's a crisis and you have left one capability aside because you're going to focus somewhere else, you need to have the trust that your other ally or allies will be there with the capabilities that they have promised. Not an easy problem. The second one is, and any investor in non-defense areas will tell you this, sometimes you have to spend money in the short run to save money in the long run. Even if you want to combine your defense, say your defense academies with those of a neighbor. 3 or 4 countries have been thinking of doing this. One of those countries is going to have to expand its facilities and its infrastructure and so forth. And you may save money in the long run, but somebody has to come up and belly up to the bar in the short run and say, yes, I'm willing to do this. And in the current environment, very few countries want to spend more on anything. And some defense ministries are afraid, well, I may do a very good job of showing people that I can do something and save some money, But why should I? Because then I'm going to lose the money. It'll go back to the finance ministry and then go off to some other part of the government fund. I don't know if that's the situation in Ireland, but there are some concerns about that here, I know in other allies as well. And that takes a political commitment to say, this is not just about saving money. If it's just about saving money, you could have a death spiral. The last thing I'll mention is that there's something that's not on the agenda openly at Chicago, and maybe simply the time isn't right. And it's a question of relations between NATO and the European Union. 21 members of the EU are members of NATO. 5 of the other 6, I'm leaving aside Croatia, which will join a little bit later. 5 of the other 6, including Ireland, obviously, are members of Partnership for Peace. It would be strange indeed if those 26 countries were schizophrenic and looked at their security interests through a NATO lens and came up with a different conclusion than if they looked at their security interests through an EU lens. Secondly, those countries only have €1 or one other currency to spend on defense. None of our countries is out there, or none of the members of both is out there creating a NATO army and an EU army, or a NATO Air Force or an EU Air Force. Moreover, it'd be very dangerous. You couldn't afford it, but it'd be very dangerous to try to do it. Imagine trying to train your defense forces to think with the left side of their brain for the EU and the right side of their brain for NATO and maybe some other part for the UN operations. That's a formula for disaster and frankly, for getting people killed. I was at the Pentagon and saw this transition. I saw a transition when the French and the British came up with the idea of a greater EU, for the first time actually in 1998, EU responsibilities in the defense and security area. The idea that the EU should have a military capability to act when NATO was not involved. And the US reaction, frankly, was chilly. The Secretary of State at the time said, well, as long as this doesn't decouple and discriminate, and it was a message of no, which is very strange for a nation that has been hectoring Europeans for decades to do more for defense. This changed by the end of 2000. I helped, I think, play a modest role in getting that change, but it was a change led by the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen at the time, who had the wisdom to say, this is ridiculous. If Europe can develop better capabilities through the EU, we should welcome it and not look at this in some kind of begrudging way, because those same capabilities are going to be available to NATO or in other configurations for that reason. Same strategy, same pool of forces, only one budget. Let's have the organizations work together and cooperate for the better benefit of all of us. But it was at the end of the Clinton administration. President Bush came in and Secretary Rumsfeld with a different view of the world. We went through this period of competition, suspicion, frankly, on both sides of the fence. But I'll end with some good news. The good news is that war of theology is over. It's impossible for me to find anyone that I would consider even a little bit more conservative or a little bit more liberal in the defense establishment to think that it's a good idea that the EU is weak. And most Americans are not concerned that the EU is going to do too much in defense and security. We're concerned that you're going to do too little. It's not a perfect situation, but there is some cooperation. There are some formal agreements and some formal contacts. Not just meetings at a very high political level, but there's still one EU operation in Bosnia that's run under these Berlin Plus agreements, meaning there's actually the deputy military commander, the DSAC here he's called in NATO, who's the operational commander for that now rather small mission in Bosnia. But that, and there are other similar things, that gives a reason for senior EU officials to be in contact with senior NATO officials. And I don't think they only talk about Bosnia when the meeting's over and they walk out or have coffee or whatever. There's a whole range of informal contacts as well that's improving over time. Sometimes certain NATO members will protest about these, but certain members of the EU will as well. There's growing operational cooperation, even in the absence of formal agreements. NATO military operation in Kosovo, working still very well now, by and large, I'm told, with the EU operation, civilian operation in Kosovo. By the way, there are about 70 Americans in Kosovo who are civilian policemen, and they wear EU patches. They are police trainers working within an EU mission in Kosovo. Who would have thought of this a few years ago? And in Afghanistan, after a rough start, pretty good cooperation, I'm told now, between the NATO training mission in Afghanistan and the EU. I've written some papers on some ideas how this cooperation might be expanded. I'm happy to share those with those who might be interested. But in the end, we're going to have to do a better job at working between these two organizations in a complementary way, particularly in the area of civil-military affairs. For me, it's kind of like a dance. We started out a decade ago, and it was a minuet, where we had NATO and the EU, you know, in a very stately but rigid way, barely kind of touching their fingertips together. And I think the relationship has to evolve more towards a tango, where the two are pretty closely intertwined, but still working independently. And I say this, but in the end, whatever type of a dance it's going to be, if one of those organizations slips and falls, the other one will as well. They're just too intertwined strategically in terms of capabilities and in terms of the values, really, that I think are important. And that brings back to the transatlantic relationship where I tried to start. So, with my apologies to Muriel Humphrey for violating a little bit of her rule, that's my overview.